Hi everyone, welcome to the Sports Psych Show. Now today I'm joined by coach and author Cody Royle. Cody, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on, Dan.
No problem at all. Now, quite often I introduce my guests, but I thought on this occasion I'd get you to introduce yourself to the audience. So why don't you tell everyone who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. Cody Royle, like you mentioned, I'm the head coach of Canada's Aussie Rules program, the AFL program over here. And so Aussie Rules is my background. I'm from Melbourne originally, now live in Toronto. And as you mentioned, last year I published a book called Where Others Won't, which was a little bit of a mishmash between some of my sports experience in building high-performing teams and the corporate world as well. And I think I'm the second La Trobe University person to be on your show. Is that right, Dan?
I believe you are, yeah. Lara Mossman was...
That's it. Our small little school's doing well then.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I've read your book, and it was absolutely fantastic. There weren't golden nuggets. It was a sort of a spray of golden dust, basically. There's so many great stories, so many great examples. The use of psychological terms, which was really exciting for me to sort of bring theory in line with applied examples and applied work. But before we get onto that, I'm really curious, Cody, because when I discovered you and your work, I found out that you're an AFL coach in Canada, which seems quite incongruous to me. So tell the audiences how that's kind of how that works. Is AFL quite popular in Canada? How have you come to be an AFL coach, an Aussie Rules coach in Canada?
Yes, I was in it's called the TAC Cup program as a coach before I left. So
what's the
I dropped out of
TAC Cup, Cody?
The feeder competition to the AFL, so like the under-19s.
Okay.
And so I really gravitated towards coaching, and particularly coaching at the elite level. So I don't think I'm particularly good at teaching the game, but if you come with the skills, I can make you better. And so I sought out an opportunity similar to that when I got here to Canada, and the national program was that. So they're not expat Aussies, they're all Canadians. And we have leagues scattered all around the country, from Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, Toronto, Montreal, and now one in Nova Scotia as well. So we're literally coast to coast. AFL Canada has a full-time staff member now, so it when I say it's growing, it certainly is. And so my job is to pull together the best talent we have across the country, and we aim towards the International Cup, which is every 3 years in Melbourne. And there's about 25 countries compete in that.
You said something really interesting there, actually. You said that you wouldn't necessarily be the best development coach, but your skill lies in being an elite coach. Out of interest, what do you think the difference in the two is? What makes you say that?
Yeah, I think they're a different skill set, to be quite honest. I guess like you would have a school teacher where you might specialise in the lower grades and teaching kind of fundamentals, or you might be a grade 12 teacher or working with 16, 17, 18-year-olds. It's actually a different job. So that's how I've always perceived it. And I think my best work is with guys that already have the baseline skills, and then I can add some cherry on top of that.
And so you've got these elite competitors in your program. You say you're better at an elite level. So where do you feel your skills lie? What are your skills to be this elite coach, if you like?
Yeah, so I think I view the game quite differently. There's a lot of nuance to Aussie Rules, and one of the things that I've probably found out through coaching Canadians was an example of something that I do is I basically coach in whatever sport they've come from. So they obviously don't grow up with the sport. Yeah. Some people, when they start playing, they haven't even watched the game. So, they've just seen someone kicking a ball in the park, and they've come down the next day and played. So you know, these guys are coming out of Canadian college rugby, hockey, basketball, soccer, and so when they can visualize a particular skill, they can execute it. Whereas, so I talk to them in that language. So you would say something like, it'd be like boxing out. If a center in basketball was boxing out to try and grab a rebound, someone that had come from basketball would understand what that means. And I'm going to put my hips in front of my opponent, and then I'm going to jump up and try and catch it. So little things like that where they can actually hear me say it and then go, okay, yeah, I get that, and replicate the behaviour.
That's really interesting. You're using the language of other sports to be able to create the building blocks of skill within Aussie rules. Mm-hmm. So you're kind of you clearly have a passion for all sports, and you have would you say, a good degree of knowledge of other sports, and so subsequently bringing that knowledge, that language, onto the Aussie rules pitch. So communication and language must play a big part within your coaching.
Big time, yeah. For me, I think just because of the nature of what we're trying to do here, the communication just has to be top notch, and you can't get stuck explaining it one way. It might have to be 10 ways, and you just have to get comfortable with that. But yeah, I really enjoy that nuance of it and the small details, because I think that's where Aussie rules games are won. It's actually not in the kicking and the handballing. There's little other things that tend to add up over the course of 120 minutes that will get you the win.
What other things would those be? So as you say that, okay, if I apply what you've just said to something like soccer or football, and I'm not a soccer or football coach, but I obviously function in that sport quite heavily from a psychological perspective, mm-hmm. I would say the subtle nuances lie in the anticipation, the awareness, the decision making, finding myself in the right position because of a subtle decision I've made, or because I've just been that 100th of a second quicker with my anticipation. Are those the right kind of small things you're talking about, or other sort of strategical areas?
No, you've nailed it there. So the big ones are space, exactly the same as soccer, and pressure. And so space in terms of when we have the ball, and then pressure when the opposition have the ball. And so, if you think about even in the NFL, the quarterbacks, the difference in skill actually isn't that large. Where the variance is in the offensive line and their ability to create space for that player to do his job. So if you give an average NFL quarterback time and space, he'll be able to execute. And it's the same in Aussie rules. If we have time and space and communication and someone is able to execute their skills properly, we're going to be a hell of a lot better off than if we're constantly under pressure and we're just kind of dribbling the ball on the ground 15 metres at a time.
How do you try to coach space? How do you try to coach it? Is that again through a communication process, or you setting up your activities in order for players to understand the sort of space-time position relationship? Or is it a bit of both?
Yeah, certainly a bit of both. I mean, I try to build all of my drills around some sort of spatial awareness. So there's a lot of box drills, and a defender inside the box. Even if we're doing a full ground drill, there'll be some sort of closed, compartmentalized area, just to drill them in. Again, because these guys mostly haven't grown up in a 365 degree game where you can be tackled from anywhere or pressured from anywhere, and so we're just trying to drill that into them. And it's just there's subtleties to it. So generally, if you were to give a handball, you would then go on and block straight away, and so that then creates that space that we're talking about.
How long have you been coaching this AFL team for, the Canadian AFL team?
Since 2012.
Okay, so 6 years. Mm-hmm. So if communication you say is a really important piece within your coaching. So if you were to assess your communication skills as a coach from now as compared to 2012? And in your mind, you might give yourself a mark out of 10 now and a mark out of 10 for your communication skills back in 2012. How much has it developed, and how have you helped yourself develop your communication skills?
That's a good question.
Sorry, I feel like I'm putting you through a psychology session here, but I just think it's fascinating. So, yeah, please.
No, this is great. I think early on, I probably defaulted to tactics, and then now I think the game is kind of more so in creating emotional bonds with each individual. So it's something I've learned, and I've learned through observing others, and obviously you can tell from the book that I wrote that I observe all sorts of sports and all sorts of businesses and take things from all sorts of different disciplines and try to learn from them. And so I would probably give myself maybe a 7 when I started, and I don't know, maybe an 8.5 now. Certainly still room to improve, and that's an area that I still want to keep working on. But I'd say I've moved from more defaulting to explaining the tactics of the game at the start, and now getting to know the guy so that I can address him properly, and then also that cumulative effect and know how to address the team as a whole and how they're going to react to situations.
That's really interesting. So what I think I hear you say is that back in 2012, 2013, there was a lot on tactic, and now it's much more about an emotional bond, the psychosocial side of things. So it's not so much a change of style of communication, it's a change of type of communication. You've directed it more towards that psychosocial, that emotional piece. And as a consequence, that's also helped you improve your communication with players because you know them that much better now?
I think so, yeah. And this was a time thing as well. I would have loved to have done this all from the start, but we only get a certain amount of time together. But I think that that drilling down into who that person really is and what motivates them away from the field and understanding their world, it allows you to build the tactics and the skills and everything on top of that a lot more effectively, I find anyway. How does the mechanism behind that work, do you think? You've made a statement there, and it's a statement I wholeheartedly agree with in terms of that psychosocial piece drives those other areas. So if I get that right, that psychosocial piece, if I understand my players' worlds better, it helps me be a better coach of technique. It helps me be a better coach of tactics. But why do you think that is, Cody? And I think it's going to be a unique answer for everybody. But how does that help you be a better coach of tactics and technique? Why? I think it's a level of comfortableness, and I think we obviously learn better when we're in comfortable situations rather than stressful situations. And I think potentially with what we've been doing, where we are teaching a new game and there's going to be a lot of imposter syndrome from the player's perspective, like, what am I doing here? This is too much for me. So it's already kind of a stressful environment, and I think you can cut through that with some of the more emotional stuff, and again, it'll be a small thing. You might even use a music example to describe a skill, but that then has them take a deep breath and go, okay, like, this guy gets me, and now I'm a little bit more comfortable. And it's not going to work every time, like you mentioned, but I think you're on a better path if you use that rather than just addressing everyone with a single message and not really being able to understand how they're viewing the game and what you're trying to teach them.
I think it's interesting, isn't it, Cody? Because you mentioned the word stress there, and I personally, in my practice, I talk about getting a balance between stretch and support. I do think whether stress is the right word, but there has to be stretch if we want players to get better. But it's really interesting what you're saying there, because as you were speaking, I was thinking of it's turning down the volume of the wrong type of stress and perhaps turning up the volume of the right type of stress. And let me just explain that in terms of listening to you speak. It's you've got these players turning up and you want them to feel comfortable from a person social perspective. By the sound of it, I feel comfortable with my teammates here, with my coach, and you're doing everything you can do to get to know them and help them feel comfortable from a person social perspective. If there is, I'm guessing, going to be any kind of stress or stretch in your coaching environment, it's going to be towards I'm creating an activity here that's going to stretch you physically or stretch you technically. So it's kind of getting that stress in the right way and getting rid of that negative stress, if you like, maybe.
Totally. Exactly right.
Yeah. So now your book, and as I alluded to earlier, it was a real joy to read. I really enjoyed going through it, and what I'd like to do is kind of just take this chapter by chapter. But why don't you tell us sort of what was the motivation behind the book, what led you to writing this book, and we'll go from there.
Yeah. So the book was a moment in time for me where I was exiting the corporate world. So while I was, on the weekends, I was trying to build this high-performing environment and successful teams in the sports world, and then I would walk into a big corporate company and experience the exact opposite. And so I became really interested in those parallels and why we tend to get it in sport and why we apply so much emphasis on our people. But then in the corporate world, they talk about it a lot, but I don't think we really get it. And so I really wanted to dig into that, and I thought I was uniquely positioned to do that because of the work I've been doing on both sides. So it's one thing to have Alex Ferguson tell you about a business environment, but it's dubious whether he actually gets it, hasn't lived it, right?
Yeah.
And so it's cool to hear that, but I thought I was uniquely placed in actually being in the trenches in both, and hence the kind of, the subtitle of, taking people innovation from the locker room into the boardroom. So yeah, it was released in December last year, and it's been a joy. It's impacted a lot of people, which I'm very thankful for.
Well, the book is called Where Others Won't. And I'm not surprised it's impacted a lot of people. Obviously, this is the Sports Psych show, so it's important to keep the theme around sport here. But your chapter 1 engages me straight away because, again, it's a passion of mine. The first chapter is entitled "Don't Forget Their People." And wow, how many times I think I've said something like this, or something alluding to this to coaches, to managers within sport. Don't forget their people. Tell us a little bit. Again, I know you were writing for a corporate audience, but we've got a lot of sports coaches and participants and parents, and it's so relevant for coaches, isn't it? Don't forget their people. They're not machines.
Totally. And yeah, I mean, the first chapter is very corporate, kind of setting the scene, but even just when we're thinking about the world we live in now in analytics and numbers and data and things like that, and it's easy to forget that there's a person behind that, and that exists both in the corporate world and in the sporting world. And you can get caught up in the running data of players or whatever it is you want to focus on. But to our previous conversation, you still need to understand the person behind that. And I think both worlds have maybe lost their way a little bit there, and I was just trying to refocus everyone with that opening chapter and a bit of a punch in the nose to start.
Well, as I always say, people have different needs, wants, hopes, doubts, beliefs, expectations, values, cultures, backgrounds, etc., experiences. So, everybody's different, aren't they? And when you've got 15, 20 people, they might be young people, they might be teenagers, they might be players in their 20s, which I assume is sort of the age group you're looking at, you're working with. Everybody's different, and that must impact your coaching on a day-to-day basis, right?
Definitely, yeah. It's basically, what I spend my most time on now.
Yeah, which obviously you've alluded to. And then in chapter 2, the best ask better questions. Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I think I know where you're coming from here, and questioning, being a psychologist, questioning is a big part of my work. But tell us a little bit about why. What do you mean by the best ask better questions? Why is that relevant to a coach?
Yeah, so the first 3 chapters are based around recruitment, and I was obsessed with this idea from Bill Walsh, who was a famous San Francisco 49ers coach. He coached the 4 Super Bowls through the 80s and early 90s, and I've got his Bible, essentially. It is described as the Bible of the NFL, and he writes down absolutely everything and his whole idea around the game. And one of the things in there is he would challenge his recruiters to say, like, what can this guy do for us? Not what they can't, not what their shortcomings are. Like, what could he do? And I became obsessed with that idea and how powerful that is from both a sporting perspective, because, again, we tend to focus on the negatives, what players can't do. Flipping that on its head, and the corporate world can learn a hell of a lot from this. What can this person do, and how do I put them in an environment where they can do that more often?
But I think it's interesting that you mentioned the corporate world can learn a hell of a lot, but I think we betray ourselves in sport when we're so keen as coaches to, as you allude to, focus on what a player doesn't have, because we're kind of in fault-fixing mode a lot of the time, aren't we? It's how can I help this player be better? And I was talking to quite a prominent footballer, striker, the other day, and I said, if you had one tip for a youngster, what would it be? And the first thing he said was, build on your strengths. Build a strength into a weapon, sharpen the sword, if you like, to really have a strong weapon. And I think that's, as coaches, it's also important to direct our attention towards the best of what a player has, so you can help them recognise the best of what they have.
Absolutely. And getting back to the name of the chapter, asking better questions, that's what I'm talking about, is like developing a portfolio of language to uncover that within players. What do you think you're good at? And generally it's going to be different to what you as the coach think they're good at. At least in my experience, I think they're generally off, but at least it creates a dialogue with your player. I love that you think you're great at that, but I actually think you're really good over here as well. And now you have a dialogue about performance that you wouldn't have otherwise.
It's such a strong mediator of confidence and self-efficacy, isn't it? I mean, I love what you said, that portfolio of language. Helping players, building those questions. I thought you were going to, actually, as you were saying it, I thought you were going to say a portfolio of questions. I mean, I think that building that booklet of questions that can help tap into player strengths, best moments, things that players do have that are going to help them in adversity. That's just so important, isn't it? It really is.
It is, and I think the really important part is this isn't a one-off type of thing. This needs to be a constant thing. As people's lives change, what we don't do a very good job of is going back and checking in. So, in the business world, when your salesperson has a kid and can no longer, work long hours, their lives changed, and so you need to know. That kind of constant check-in and where those strengths are and how their lives are changing and kind of understand that dynamic.
Now, chapter 4 is entitled A Leader is a Coach. A Leader is a Coach. So you obviously define leadership as someone who co-creates solutions, who helps others develop themselves. Tell me a bit about coaching within a leadership role.
Yeah, again, it sounds like it goes hand in hand, but what I was really getting at, and what I am getting at, is the power in coaching. And the example, the big example that I like in this one was just the whole thing around the Icelandic national team and how they have essentially coached themselves into the world's elite, and invested in creating more and more coaches, rather than investing in shipping everyone off to Barcelona to go through their academies. Keep them locally and coach them as best we can, and just keep pouring more and more effort into the coaches that they have. And I think that's a really powerful idea that we don't always think about. We tend to think about getting the better players, but not about investing in the infrastructure around the coaches. And again, the business world is the same here, where I think a lot of leaders just kind of point the way, but they don't actually, like you said, really get in and coach people and create benefit in the people underneath them.
I think during that chapter you have a quote that I loved from a character called Ralph Kruger.
Mm-hmm.
Who said, you could actually introduce us to who Ralph Kruger is, but I loved this quote. Success is being honest about where your potential is and going after your potential. The byproduct is winning, which is what the world sees as success.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that notion because it's kind of pointing towards process. If we get the process right, if we develop ourselves towards our potential, and if we help others, let's think from a coaching perspective here, if we help others to develop themselves towards their potential, hey look, the winning's just going to take care of itself. So I think you described Ralph Kruger as the most interesting man in the world, which is a bold statement, but tell us a little bit about Ralph.
I think he's the most interesting man in the world. So Ralph is the chairman of Southampton Football Club, and but he is a Canadian German.
Right.
He's an ice hockey coach. He coached the Swiss national team for a decade. He coached the Edmonton Oilers in the NHL, and then with the Canadian national team in Sochi. And then the owner of Southampton gave him a call and said, I saw what you did with the Swiss national team, and I'd like you to come and run a Premier League team. And so obviously there was a lot of doubt as to how a hockey coach could benefit a Premier League team. But he's done some incredible stuff there, and consults to the World Economic Forum, and he's just a fascinating character and someone who is just a lifelong coach. And he still says that. When we were talking on the phone, he said, I just come in every day and I still coach. I'm the chairman now, but it's exactly the same as when I was a hockey coach.
Okay, so he goes through a process of helping his staff be the best that they can be, or striving to reach their potential. And just allowing that winning to take care of itself, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that quote too, because it is, winning is a byproduct. You got to get the other stuff right first, and we tend to focus on the outcome and not the process. And there's a lot to learn in that space.
Wow, and there's another quote there that I took from the chapter. Again, it's along the same vein, but the winning is a byproduct, not a focus. The focus will be excellence. It will be our execution, our practices. So again, it's our excellence. It's those many behaviours that we engage in every day, and it's the execution of those behaviours, and it's our practices. It's what we do every day. And I suppose, as Kruger alludes to, the world looks at, are you winning? Are you losing? Whereas when you can direct people's attention towards the how, the little things every day, then that can make a big difference.
Totally, yeah, absolutely, and that's now built into what they do at Southampton, and I don't think was really there. Obviously, they had that period where they were down in League One and kind of rebuilt the club, but excellence is part of their motto now, and that was all based around that idea that you just described.
Now, you declare that the second most interesting man in the world is a guy called Rick Charlesworth, who I know is a fellow countryman of yours, and I was introduced to one of Rick's books by quite a prominent coach. Tell us a little bit about Rick Charlesworth, if you can.
Yeah, Rick definitely challenges Ralph. Rick is a field hockey coach. He's most famous in Australia for coaching the Hockeyroos, which is our women's national team, to Olympic gold. He also worked with the men's program for quite some time. He was a state-level cricketer. He was a MP for maybe 10 years and played in 5 or 6 Olympic Games himself in hockey. So just a very well-rounded individual and has some really used some fascinating concepts in terms of how he organised his teams throughout his career.
I love, in terms of fascinating concepts, I loved what he did with the Hockeyroos, so the women's hockey team. He created small leadership groups, didn't he? And he kind of rotated responsibilities over time. So one group was responsible for training, one for the social environment, another one, even one for looking at other sports to learn things from, another one for scouting. I mean, wow, that to me it's such a simple thing, but we're so, when teams do have a leadership group, it tends to be a leadership group. It tends to be the 4, 5, 6 oldest players, or best players, and that tends to be how it works, rather than, okay, how can we give responsibilities to all players here? I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and very innovative for its time. Like they were at their peak in 2000 in Sydney, and so at that time, he was like, we don't have a captain. We have, I don't know how many people are on a field hockey team, 20. We have 20 captains. And so it seemed a bit zany at that time, but absolutely when you stand back and take a look at it, and why shouldn't everyone act like a captain and take on those responsibilities and learn about them? And what they found was they didn't have that same drop-off when you lose your captain, like if your captain's injured. Yeah. They didn't have the motivational drop-off. They didn't have the skill drop-off. They didn't have the inspirational drop-off because they had 19 others. And, he kind of declares that was one of the core philosophies that had so much success with that team.
I'd imagine that it would have to be quite skillfully executed because, and I absolutely agree and resonate with the notion of developing leaders having a density of leadership. And I personally believe in a sporting teams that there are different types of leaders. There's clearly going to be leaders who lead by action more so than voice. And when it comes to leading by voice, there's going to be energizers and then there's going to be instructors, I guess. So you kind of got action-oriented leaders, you've got energizers, and you've got instructors. That's just my world, Cody. But I could also imagine having 11 leaders on the pitch or 15 leaders on the pitch. If, say, we're talking about rugby, if everyone's a leader then, and everybody was leading via their voice, that could be a recipe for disaster if it's not executed skillfully.
Totally. And I think it as well as that, I think it gives those people, if they are an energizer, let's say, it gives them an opportunity to try the other styles of leadership as well because they're doing all these different activities. So I think there's a development portion there that I really like. And to be honest with you, like this isn't going to work for every team.
Of course.
And I think what went in Rick's favour and the Hockeyroos' favour is I think that notion is kind of entrenched in being Australian. And so it was a national team, obviously, and part of our kind of work ethic as a country is to help others, and so I think that went in their favour. It might not work at a Premier League club, as an example.
I think that's I'd never really thought of it like that, Cody. I think that's really interesting, sort of a cultural, it's not necessarily cross-culturally valid, that it might only work in certain cultures. So I think that's really interesting. And talking about interesting things, sort of leading to the next chapter, which I loved, you've entitled it "Experience Doesn't Equal Leadership," which, yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, and it kind of goes against the popular grain. But tell me a bit about experience not equaling leadership.
Yeah, so again, a little bit of that frustration from the business world, where we tend to grab the the best sale or most experienced salesperson and make them a leader, or the most experienced person and they get the managerial job. And then you look at what's going on in the sporting world, and we've got people like Julian Nagelsmann and what he's doing, and he's younger than me. He's 29, I think, when he took over at Hoffenheim, and has basically dragged them into Europe. And for all intents and purposes, that shouldn't have worked out. He hadn't even finished his coaching badges when they gave him the job. But that experience doesn't matter, because I think that there are natural leaders like him, or people that had some natural leadership skills and were able to build upon them. And I think we need to find better ways for getting those people into leadership pathways earlier, rather than making them kind of do the hard yards. And then, we want them in at age 30, not at age 40, if that makes sense. Because I think our teams would be better off, and our society would be better off if we could get those actual leaders into positions of leadership.
Absolutely, and I think you used the term in here, cognitive entrenchment, which is, Professor Eric Dane from Rice University coined that term with relation to the notion that experts use their current knowledge without being flexible in their worldview. So when leaders are like that, they're not actually being mentally flexible, they're not actually looking at the environment from a nimble enough perspective. And actually great leadership is being nimble, it is learning, it's learning from experience, but looking at the world perhaps in a future oriented way, and saying, well, the past doesn't necessarily equal the future. So it sounds like that cognitive entrenchment, being entrenched in your own beliefs or your own thought patterns, can actually be a bad thing. And with Nagelsmann, if I'm pronouncing that wrong, one of the quotes I loved from him, which is particularly pertinent to this show, is he said, "Every player is motivated by different things and needs to be addressed accordingly. At this level, the quality of the players at your disposal will ensure that you play well within a good tactical setup, if the psychological condition is right." So he's quite forward-thinking in his thinking about the psychosocial side.
Definitely, yeah. And I couldn't agree more with him. I'm fascinated by him as a character, and I've been interested to see the results that they've been able to produce. But yeah, it's such an interesting topic, that the cognitive entrenchment. That's actually a really interesting paper I would recommend people go and read, that I mention in the book. And Professor Dane actually goes on to write more about even the way academics write papers being a cognitive entrenchment, and they're just boring and mundane and don't speak to the broader world. They're speaking to other scientists rather than trying to get this idea out to the broader world, and that's a cognitive entrenchment, within the academia. So it exists everywhere, not just in business or in sport.
How do you deal with that yourself, Cody? Because obviously you know this stuff. Do you purposefully strive not to get entrenched in certain ways of thinking? What do you actually do?
That's a good question. Because I'm so interested in all different sports, I think it kind of makes me constantly challenge my own ideas on things. And that goes right to tactics. Like I blatantly rip tactics from other sports and use them in Aussie rules, and maybe they shouldn't apply, but I've found something that will allow that to happen. So I've created an environment for myself where through my knowledge acquisition, I think I'm actually challenging myself constantly as well. I'd say the next stage for me is to have someone on my staff that does that, and is constantly saying, yeah, but what about this? Or I think that would be good as a third party as well.
As you were saying that, I was thinking back to a presentation I saw back in April where somebody said every football club, they were talking about football specifically here, but it's the same for every club who has the resources. Every club should have a head of methodology. Not just to provide rationale for what they do in every department, but also to ask questions, to question everything they do. And that's tough to do, isn't it, Cody? Do you find that quite difficult to keep a coherent plan with your activities, with your players, but at the same time question everything you do?
Yeah, and there's sometimes where you need to be able to just cut through all the questions and move forward. You can get bogged down in that, certainly, and it is a little bit of a trap. It is valuable, obviously, highly valuable, to be consistently trying to innovate. But, there are times, certainly, where you can just be weighed down with why we're doing this, and unable to move forward. But, I think, to your point, I love that idea, to have someone in charge of that, and even so that they can help push forward when we need to just move forward. That's a brilliant idea. Love it.
I think that sort of is a neat segue inadvertently onto the next chapter, which is leadership is contextual, which again I think is a really interesting chapter and an interesting notion that leadership shouldn't necessarily be seen as a set of static behaviours, that leadership is contextual because every situation is contextual. Is that kind of what you're saying here?
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's where we need to be moving the leadership discussion to, is a little bit like we've been talking about with results and winning. The process of it is what's actually interesting, and I don't think leadership discussion focuses on that. But I read a book by I forget his name, but he has this quote from Brendan Rodgers talking about Mario Balotelli and saying, his backstory means that you can't treat him like everyone else. Like there aren't many people who, were one of 5 children in their family and were the only one given up for adoption to a new country, and so you can't treat him like everyone else. And I think that's a really powerful idea, and we've been talking about this theme quite consistently, but I think leaders need to be consistently scanning for the context of the decision that we're about to make, and gathering the environment and who this person is, and bundling that all together to make a better decision, rather than just being focused on, well, I'm this type of leader, so I'm going to deal with this situation in this particular way.
It reminds me of that question, how do you manage your talent? And it's something that certainly in elite sports, we might think of a Balotelli, as you're saying there. I can think of, and I won't name names because it would be, as a psych, it would be unethical of me to do so, but I can think of numerous examples of in different sports of players who have been the best player on the team, or certainly in the top 2 or 3, and can be game changers, but can be so destructive as human beings. And it's finding a way to amalgamate them into the team, and if you can't do that, enabling them to play on your team irrespective of their behaviours, essentially. And that's a tough challenge, isn't it, mate? It really is.
It is. It's the ultimate challenge. Fitting those puzzle pieces together is the ultimate challenge. But yeah, I agree with you there. I think it's certainly the easy way to get rid of that highly talented but destructive person. But there's also the question whether you can set that person up for success and properly integrate them into the team. And maybe that is just as the X Factor player, but everyone knows that guy's there just because he's an X Factor.
It makes you think that, for me, so much of this has to be set by your players. And again, obviously, we're not talking about 10, 11, 12-year-olds here. For coaches who are listening in or who are under 12s, they might not, your 12-year-olds might not set your culture, or maybe they do. But
maybe
I think, it is. If I think again about all the challenging personalities out there who play elite level sport, and is it the teammates who make the decisions? Is it does a leader, a manager, a head coach empower this player's teammates to amalgamate that player into the team, to help that player feel a part of the team? And if they can't do that, is there a choice to be made by whether you call them the leadership group or groups, or the team as a whole? Is it outsourced kind of like that from the leader onto those players?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? And there seems to be a vast array of ways that that's done. Like, you think about your traditional kind of, Alex Ferguson, where he was the culture and he set kind of everything, and had obviously people like Roy Keane to enact that culture. And then you've got these other environments in other sports, and where, it's almost agreed upon by just the playing group, and they agree upon their goals and how they're going to achieve them, and the coach is just there kind of as a guide. Steve Kerr from the Golden State Warriors has been one of the real advocates of that, and I want to write a little bit about that in my next book in terms of how he leads. And he blatantly says, like, it's their team, it's the players' team, and my job is to just kind of shepherd them towards where they want to go. So it's interesting because both work, so I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but I think for me, I've always liked to empower the players to set a lot of the cultural elements of our team.
There's that balance to be had, isn't there, Cody? Because the conversations I have with coaches, with leaders, with managers is exactly that. Is that where can you empower players to enforce this? Can you empower players to set the appropriate behaviours within your culture? Because when they've set it, then when they've set these behaviours, then there's more chance of them owning those behaviours and enforcing them across the organisation. At the same time, if you're talking about players enforcing the nitty-gritty, then it does, human beings have a certain working memory capacity. They have a capacity to do only so much. So there's that keen, again, it almost comes back to your leadership is contextual. There are times when you can empower players, if offload is the right word, you can empower players to set the culture, to set the behavioural standards here, to bring challenging players into the team dynamic. There's other times when you and your coaching staff might have to do it yourself, because the players still have to go out and play. They have to go out and perform. They have to be concerned with their game. So there's only so much that they can do, isn't there? So it is about being nimble, isn't it?
Totally, yeah, and we're talking about a great chapter and a great idea here with the context, and I would even add another context to that, and that would be a cultural alignment across the whole club. And whether that culture is kind of already set already through, let's say, history. So I had a really interesting conversation recently with Joe Montemuro, who's the Arsenal women's coach, and he's another Aussie, and he joined from Melbourne City, and he was talking about Arsenal's culture and how established it is, and how he fundamentally agreed with that culture coming in, and has just been about finding players that subscribe to how things are done at Arsenal. Now, that's completely different because of the success that Arsenal have from a team in the Championship who maybe haven't had success or don't have that firm culture, and you can play around with it more. So, yeah, there's an alignment factor there too, and you've kind of got to understand the team that you're walking into, and whether there's an existing culture, whether you can rip the whole thing down off the wall and say we're starting again. Again, it's all context.
So the next chapter is set the concrete first, which I assume is a metaphor. So tell us a little bit about setting the concrete first.
Yeah, on that cultural alignment discussion, it's really about making sure that you understand kind of the baseline. So exactly, it's a metaphor, and I think a lot of companies and a lot of sports teams try and put the roof on without the foundations being set. And so there's plenty of examples of that, but I think we try to go again to the result rather than the process, and actually spend the time looking internally and having dialogue about, what do we want the culture to be, and it can't just be 4 words written up on the wall and no one actually enacts them, or there's no behaviours behind them.
I think the challenge is that organisations, and again I recognise we're talking predominantly about the elite level here, although a lot of this can concern grassroots, is organisations tend to be complex systems, don't they? So that concrete, laying down that concrete can be a real headache. It does require some thinking, and so many problems stem from that lack of thoughtfulness around systems, around looking at each department, having conversations around how those departments can function effectively and how they can function together. And how people communicate together, and when you get that right, those outcomes can take care of themselves.
Exactly, and the funny thing is too, generally those departments will all have their own interpretations of the cultural elements as well. So even though they will still subscribe to the higher goal, whether that's winning, whether it's a stock price, whatever it is, the accounting department and how they interpret the culture versus the sales department is going to be different. And I think that's okay, as long as everyone's still pushing towards that same goal. But we generally try to make people subscribe to something that doesn't make sense to them when we're talking about culture and values. But I position that we should allow them to have their own little subcultures that, a certain value makes more sense to them in this way, and the other department it's a different way, but that's okay.
Well, as you allude to in the next chapter, which is entitled "Your People Own Your Culture," it is about giving way and allowing your people to create, develop the culture you have within your club, within your organisation. It's empowering them to own it, and I know we've had a little bit of conversation around that already. And then in the next chapter, you talk about fighting for your culture, for your culture. So, for me, it is about directing as a leader, directing your attention onto, how good is this going? How is my culture? How well has it gone today? What about tomorrow? What conversations are we having right now? What discourse is there? What behaviours are there? And fighting for the optimal behaviours and the most effective, most adaptive conversations within the culture. For me, that's fighting for your culture.
Absolutely, yeah. It's about being really deliberate about it. And again, I think the trap is what we do is we go on, we have this meeting, we say, okay, this is going to be our culture, and we've got a document, and then we leave it there, and we don't go out, and it's a daily process. And I love Gary Kineen. There's a great quote from him. He's with the Chicago women's team at the moment, and he said, I used to think culture was like a rousing speech, or going to the bar on a Friday for a couple of drinks. He's like, that's not it. It's it's that daily process that being very deliberate about everything about the culture, and constantly tending that garden so that it's at its optimal for us to succeed.
Maybe I go over the top here, but I'm in agreement, and I would actually define it as just about everything, really. I mean, it really is. I love the notion of culture is built in your corridors, conversations in the corridors, which it is. But it's also, for me, built into the communication on the pitch. It's built into the activities that you're doing. You know, if you, as somebody who's passionate about methodologies within coaching, if the foundations of your coaching is based on, say, information processing, I'm going to sort of an autocratic style of coaching whereby I'm going to teach every single player how to deliberately execute certain techniques. That's going to be a different culture overall than a coach who says, well, I'm going to lay out some activities here and I'm going to help my players to explore their own solutions. You know, one's a directive style, another one is a non-directive style, and the styles of coaching that you employ on the training pitch make a difference to the conversations that I had in the corridors of your club, make a difference to the conversations that I had over the dinner table, over the lunch table. It makes a difference to the conversations in the minds of your players, the conversations they're having with themselves. So culture to me is everywhere, isn't it? And it isn't just a poster on the wall. It isn't just a rousing speech. It really isn't.
No, it really isn't. And even just the idea that if you change one person on that team, technically that culture has changed. It'll never be the same as it was with that original 11 or 18 or whatever it is. One person changes, and again, that changes those conversations like you've been talking about in their heads. And so yeah, it's that constant daily grind of fighting for it and making sure that it's working for you.
Absolutely. Now, next chapter, the illusion of communication. So tell us, Cody, what is the illusion of communication?
The illusion of communication is that it's happened. And what I mean by that is it's easy to fool yourself that you have communicated effectively, if at all. I think generally what we can tend to do is give instruction the way we would want to receive it, whereas the other person might not receive it that way, or they may not receive it at all. And so there's I think a lot of downfall in communication. Both in terms of coaching environments, but even if you think about the way we communicate in the business world now with emails and things like that, and how much gets lost and how many fights get started because it was an email that didn't have a smiley face on it, and so you think they're angry. And we need to be having conversations about how we communicate, because we're never really taught how to. Like, there's no schooling system for how we communicate person to person, and I'd love for us to be a lot more deliberate about how we do that as well.
Absolutely. And as you're speaking now, I was reflecting back on a conversation I had with a football coach a couple of months ago, and I was in at this person's club observing on a Thursday for preparing for a Saturday game, and as a consequence at that elite level there is a lot of information passed over to players. There can be a lot of directive coaching, and I don't think that's about it. Somebody who is an advocate of non-directive coaching, the reality is at the elite level you do have to be directive on a Thursday and a Friday, and you have to have those conversations with players. But I think it's really interesting what you're saying, and I never really I suppose it's not that I would put it in the way you've put it, but I've never really seen it that way. The conversation I had with this coach is, you're passing on this information, but are your players listening? Are they taking it in? Are they processing this information? And if they are processing this information, are they doing so at a deep enough level whereby they will enact this information, they will carry out behaviourally this information on Saturday? And I think we can, as coaches, congratulate ourselves for, that was a great coaching session. Yeah, I got that information over there. Well, hang on a minute. What did your players hear? What did they understand? Has there been any transference at all? Will they go out on the Saturday and actually execute that stuff? Is that kind of what you're saying here?
Definitely. We tend to rate ourselves whether we felt good about the way we communicated, but we have no idea whether any of that was taken in. You could give the greatest TED talk in history, but if it makes no sense to the audience, no one cares. And again, I find this a fascinating topic around communication, and it's an area that we can all get better in for sure. And I love reading new ideas around things like this, like how are people taking in information, and to what level are they then creating something that you mean for them to create versus the way they've interpreted it.
And I also think language matters. And I come back to your lovely little idea of a portfolio of language. I mean, actually, I won't name names, but an AFL coach, a prominent one once said to me, there's the language of the athlete, and then there's the language of the coach. And for me as a sports psychologist, I'm very mindful. There's also the language of the academic. I'm very, very mindful of speaking the language of the athlete when I'm speaking to an athlete, and using the language of a coach when I'm speaking to a coach, and certainly avoiding academic terms as best I can when I'm speaking with both, although there can be room for some academic language at times. But I think the language you use makes a difference to communication and understanding of communication.
Definitely, yeah, exactly. Like we've been talking about throughout the episode, is that adaptiveness of leadership, and that's part of it. Is you got to learn the lingo, and because it goes on to your staff and doctors, and it really impacts every single person at some point. So I think again, one of the really interesting things Joe Montemuro said to me was when he realizes that he's got a team working is when they regurgitate his language, and so they actually adapt to him as well, and so they start using his terms when they're discussing things amongst themselves, which is really interesting as well.
It's a two-way process. It can be a two-way process. Again, it's getting that balance, isn't it, Cody? It's kind of there's that nimbleness again. There's times when, as a coach, you want your players to build their own language. You want to utilise that language, and then there's times really where you're trying to get across a point, and it's extremely useful if they use your language, and they develop from there. Definitely. And on this subject, going back to what you said earlier about utilising your players' experiences in other sports and using the language of other sports. Just knowing your players, know where they've been, know what they've played, and if they're now playing soccer and they've played basketball for a long time, utilising some terminology from basketball can be a really, really good idea here, because then that player might process things at a deeper level, because it's something that he or she understands better.
Yeah, it's been perfect for us because Aussie Rules is so unique. It's really hard to visualize the actions that I want you to carry out, and so hence why I do that, because there is a comparable at some level, whether it's from lacrosse, whether it's from ice hockey, field hockey, whatever the sport, I can find the comparable action. But if you handed someone a golf driver and teed up the ball for them, but they'd never seen golf before, and you said go and hit the golf ball, they wouldn't know what to do. They wouldn't know how to swing the club, what side to hit with. They'd be making it all up, and I'm cognizant of kind of that example of leaving them without that information. So I do my best to talk to them in whatever sport they're from, and I hope that it creates a better environment for them in a learning environment.
Now we've got 2 chapters to go. So penultimate one is measure inputs, not outputs. What do you mean by that? Interesting. Yeah,
again, this is more on the business side, but again, we tend to measure sales, but we don't measure any of the inputs into that sale. So someone could be a a good cold caller and they make lots of meetings, but they wouldn't be judged the same as someone that closed the deal. There's an argument to be made that closing a deal is one portion of a sale, but there are a lot of other inputs. And so, when we're thinking about, the sporting world, I think it can be much the same, where we tend to measure those outputs rather than the process and trying to refine the process. Again, going back to that idea of winning holistically being, the byproduct of all of these inputs.
But I think this is massive, Cody. I really do, mate. I think, you've alluded to the business world, and absolutely, but, coming back to that sports world, it's in the work I do, the conversations I have with coaches and managers, especially in the world of football, but all sports, where emotions, the volume of emotion is turned up high post-game, and that emotion tends to be inordinately positive when they win. I mean, it is literally like we have won the lottery, and you're just thinking, hey, there's another 40 games to go this season, let's go. This is brilliant, this is what we play for, but, and then here's me being a complete killjoy there, obviously. But, and then if we lose, it's as if there isn't another 40 games to go, and
right.
the world's against us, and it's, whoa, stop. How can we find a methodology here that helps us flatline this a little bit more? Yes, sport is about emotion. Yes, there are ups and downs, but we can't be supporters here. We can love what we do, and we can if there was no emotion involved whatsoever, we wouldn't do what we do. We do it because we love the ups and we don't like the downs, but the downs make the ups better. But we've also got to, as competitors, keep some emotional temperance here. And I think that your idea of, let's just measure the inputs, let's measure the process, let's look at the KPIs, the key performance indicators, let's look at the KMIs in my world, the key mindset indicators, and let's judge that. Because you know what, Cody? We might have won, and we might be in the red for a lot of those, and that could be exciting, right? Let's have a week now working on those things to give ourselves a chance to win next time. So it's absolutely, I agree with you, and it's so relevant for sport.
Oh, totally. There's a really brilliant video from going back to Steve Kerr, where they have him mic'd up and he's coaching Steph Curry, who's, if you're not familiar with basketball world, he's kind of on the path to be the next Michael Jordan, LeBron James in terms of stardom. Yeah. And I think the scenario is that they're losing the game. Curry's not playing well. He's not shooting well, which is his game. And what Kerr says in this little clip, and it's on YouTube, you can look it up. He says, here's your shot totals, here's your whatever, and then he brings him back to the plus minus, which is how the team does when he's on the court. So even though he's not hitting his shots, the team is actually better off. And there's little things like that and little measures like that we can start to implement. So yeah, we can flatline that emotional roller coaster a little bit and say, okay, we lost, but we hit all these inputs, so we know that we're on a path next game. If we can replicate those inputs, that we'll win the next one. Because there's a certain amount of chance as well in sport that you can't win them all. But yeah, I think we kind of need to rip down a lot of the structures that we did build up around ourselves and how we measure ourselves, and rebuild them to be more focused on those inputs rather than the outcome.
And I've actually seen that video with Steph Curry, and to me, what Steve Kerr, if we are biopsychosocial creatures, then what Steve Kerr is doing there, he's the social side of it, and he's impacting, Steph Curry's psychology. He's helping Steph see that situation in a much more positive light from a very basic standpoint. He's kind of reframing what Steph Curry is experiencing, and that's also biological as well. If Steph Curry is missing his usual quota of shots, then he's potentially releasing that stress hormone called cortisol, which is going to exacerbate poor performance. It's going to make it worse. And to reframe it, suddenly now he's releasing testosterone and dopamine and these kind of chemicals that form the building blocks of high performance. What a great job Steve Kerr's doing there from a biopsychosocial perspective, and that really, for me, when you say measure inputs not outputs, is what a coach has to do on a day by day and a week by week basis. Is try to bring, yes, sport is about emotion, but just trying to help players bring things back to a rational notion of what is happening, So on to the final chapter, and it's a great title for the last chapter, In Constant Search of Performance. So obviously we know what you mean by that, but just colour in things here in terms of the contents of that chapter.
Yeah, this really rounds out the book. The name Where Others Won't even is about being prepared to go where others won't in search of a competitive advantage. And that's what we see in sport, particularly the North American sports over here where there's salary caps and things like that. And you've got to find these little nuggets of ways that you can compete. Moneyball is a perfect example of that. And just, I think having that as a mindset, how can we constantly be searching for performance and where aren't others focusing their attention? And what I mean by that is our competitors, where are they not focusing their attention that we might be able to capitalise on? And I think that's really relevant, again, to our sports teams that we're working with and definitely the corporate world.
Working in elite sport, functioning in elite sport, Cody, I think you're absolutely spot on. And the best are... It's been called the aggregation of marginal gains, or it's been called finding your 1%ers, and those are good terms for it. And I actually think sometimes, and I think latterly, perhaps over the last decade, that certainly in British sport, some teams and organisations have got lost in those 1% and those marginal gains, and had actually performance decrements as a consequence. But I think you're absolutely spot on. It's not actioning too many things, but it is that search for what things can we do that are either going to give us the performance edge or keep us up with the best in the business, help us get into Europe in football, help me compete on the golf tour and retain my tour card, my ATP status, or whatever sport it is. I just think that's absolutely spot on and so important.
Yeah, and when you really look at particularly the team sports, but also individual sports as well, that the best, they do play on that edge. And obviously, some very prominent teams have kind of fallen off that edge recently, particularly in British sport. But it's about trying to get yourself to that edge, and that's where I think those competitive advantages are. And whether you want to call them marginal gains, 1%ers, whatever you want to term it, I think basically building into your daily workload that constant search. And where I like to get it from, obviously, is other sports. I might come up with like I mentioned before, a tactic that's in lacrosse and rip that and put that into Aussie rules. That might be a complete game changer. Obviously, professional coaches don't have a hell of a lot of time to go and study other sports, but there might be something there. Or, like I mentioned, Moneyball was a perfect example of this. We don't have the money to spend on the best players, so we're going to use data, and we'll try it and see what happens. And something pretty magical happened. And
yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of different ways to become successful, whatever success looks like for you or your team. Well, that was a fascinating entry point into your book, and I want to emphasize to everybody out there that really just is an entry point. There's so many different little anecdotes and ideas and psychological ideas and references in this book, Where Others Won't, by Cody. So Cody, how can people find your work? Where can they order the book? How can they get in contact with you?
Yeah, so the book's only on Amazon. So wherever you are, it'll be on your local Amazon. And I'm at whereotherswon't.com, so the name of the book is my .com, and Cody at whereotherswon't.com is my email address. So fairly easy to find if you can spell those three words. And I love chatting to people about different ideas, so I'd love to hear from some of your listeners, and always open for a chat on how we can all get better and go where others won't, hence the name of the book. I just love that term so much.
I think that would be a really valuable chat for a lot of people. I certainly enjoyed that conversation, and I've taken 2 or 3 pages of notes from Cody's book, Where Others Won't, so I thoroughly recommend that you pop onto Amazon and buy that. If you enjoyed today's chat, please do leave a rating and a review, and please don't forget to subscribe to the Sports Psych Show to be alerted about future episodes. I look forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.